The human was unconscious when they dragged him aboard. His wrists and ankles were bound in high tensile restraints, his body limp but intact. The slavers had learned from past mistakes not to damage their merchandise before the sale. Varric, the overlord of the Grakthar slavers, stood at the edge of the holding bay, his 4 reptilian eyes narrowing as he examined the newest captive. A human, not a particularly valuable acquisition, but the client had been insistent. A Terran, the buyer had demanded, and so a Terran they had taken. The guards tossed the human into a cell with the others. Chattel from a dozen species, their fates already sealed. Some looked away, unwilling to invest hope in another lost soul. Others watched with quiet curiosity, noting the human stillness. No groans of pain, no wild thrashing. He simply lay there, as if waiting. A burly enforcer named Gork sneered. They never last long. He slammed a boot against the human's ribs. The body rolled, but there was no reaction, no sound. Gork grunted in satisfaction. See? Soft. Then the human moved. Not a flinch, not a startled gasp, just a slow, deliberate shift as he pushed himself upright. His movements were controlled, fluid, betraying no panic, no confusion. A trickle of blood ran down his temple, where he'd been struck during capture, but he ignored it. His eyes, a dull shade of gray, swept across the room, analyzing, cataloging. He flexed his fingers against the bindings, testing them. Gork chuckled. Ah, so you're awake, little Terran. You understand what's happening, don't you? The human tilted his head, considering the question. Then, finally, he spoke. Where am I? His voice was hoarse but calm, too calm for someone in his position. You're in hell, Gork growled. Your property now. The human exhaled slowly. That's so. Varric stepped forward then, his long, clawed fingers tapping against his belt. He had been in this business long enough to recognize the different kinds of captives. Some wept, others begged, a few tried to fight. This one, he just sat there unconcerned, like a predator biding its time. What do they call you, human? Varric asked. The prisoner turned his gaze toward him, unreadable and steady. Then, with the faintest of smirks, he answered, Reaper. The name rippled through the chamber like a silent wave. Some of the older slaves inhaled sharply. A Zalari priest in the corner muttered a quiet curse. Even Varric felt the hairs along his scaled spine bristle, though he quickly dismissed it. A name was just a name. Gork, unimpressed, barked a laugh. Reaper? What kind of pathetic nickname is that? He turned to the others, spreading his arms mockingly. Oh, so scary. Should we be trembling? Little Reapers? The human said nothing, just kept looking. Varric sighed. Enough of this. Throw him with the others. If he fights, break something non-essential. Gork grinned, reaching for the human's arm. The moment his hand made contact, Reaper moved. It was a fraction of a second, a blur of motion that sent Gork stumbling back, cursing, his wrist twisted at an unnatural angle. The room tensed. The other slavers raised their weapons, but Reaper hadn't moved beyond that single act of defiance. He just sat there, head tilted slightly, observing the way they reacted, measuring them. Varric's temper flared. He stepped forward, seizing Reaper's chin in a clawed grip and forcing him to meet his gaze. You think you're special, human, he hissed. You're just another sack of flesh. I've broken stronger creatures than you. Reaper smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I doubt that. Varric snarled and threw him back. Take him below. Let's see how long he lasts. The guards hoisted him up and hauled him deeper into the ship. They passed cells filled with the broken and the hopeless, prisoners too exhausted to meet his eyes. But Reaper looked at each of them, his expression unchanged, his mind already working. They reached the lower levels, where the real cruelty began. The air was thick with the scent of blood and rust. Here, discipline was maintained through fear, and suffering was entertainment. They threw him into a holding pen with half a dozen others, emaciated beings who had long since given up. A frail alien with translucent skin and too many joints scurried back, whispering, "Don't fight them. They make it worse when you fight." Reaper looked at the thing, at the hunchbacks and hollow stares of the others. He glanced at the thick metal door, at the flickering lights overhead, at the placement of the vents. A plan was already forming. Another prisoner, a Xylaph warrior with a broken horn, scoffed. "You're wasting your time, human. Escape is impossible." Reaper smirked. "Nothing's impossible." The Xylaph gave a bitter laugh. "They will break you." Reaper rolled his shoulders, testing the stiffness in his muscles. "They can try." Outside the cell, Gork was still cradling his injured wrist, his face twisted in fury. He slammed a fist against the controls, sending a jolt of electricity through the bars. The prisoners flinched as the shock coursed through them, but Reaper didn't make a sound. He just kept staring at Gork, unblinking. Gork sneered. "You're going to regret that little stunt, Reaper." Reaper tilted his head. "Doubt that, too." The enforcer growled but didn't open the door. Not yet. Instead, he leaned in close, his grin cruel. "Enjoy your last few days of arrogance. You'll be begging soon enough." Reaper held his gaze for a long moment. Then, softly, he said, "You don't know what you brought aboard your ship, do you?" Gork bared his teeth. "And what's that?" Reaper leaned back against the wall, settling in like a man getting comfortable before a storm. "A problem." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Gork's face. Just for a moment. Then he turned and stomped away, muttering curses under his breath. Reaper closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. He felt the weight of the ship around him, the hum of its systems, the rhythms of its crew. They thought they had captured a helpless human. They had no idea what they had trapped themselves with. The first scream echoed down the steel corridors, guttural and raw. It was followed by a second, then a third. The guards snapped to attention, weapons drawn, their reptilian faces contorted in confusion. Prisoners didn't scream like that, not unless something had gone very, very wrong. Gork stormed into the lower decks, his heavy boots pounding against the grated floor. His wrists still throbbed from the human's earlier defiance, and he was in no mood for another incident. As he neared the containment cells, the stench of burning flesh hit him. A guard was slumped against the wall, his body twitching, eyes glassy. The crude shiv protruding from his throat was hardly worth noting. What mattered was the control panel beside him, sparking, its circuits fried. The energy field that had kept the prisoners confined was down. Gork turned just in time to see a shadow dart past. Too fast, too controlled. He fired his weapon, but the plasma bolt struck only air. Lights to full. He barked into his comm. The overhead fluorescence flared to life, illuminating chaos. Prisoners surged from the open cells like a flood, their desperation weaponized into fury. The guards, caught off guard, scrambled to contain them, but the riot spread with ruthless efficiency, and at the center of it all was a human. He moved like a ghost, appearing and vanishing between flashes of gunfire. A stolen combat blade gleamed in his grip, its serrated edge painted in fresh blood. He didn't fight like the other prisoners, wild and frantic. His movements were methodical, precise. Every cut was deliberate. Every bullet he fired struck its mark. Gork swore and activated his communicator. "We've got a breach. Containment Deck 5. The human is loose." Static. Then, distorted by interference, a voice crackled through. "No, the ship is loose." Gork barely had time to process the words before the ventilation system roared to life. A dense, colorless gas flooded the corridors, seeping into every crevice. The air reeked of chemicals, acrid and thick. Then the hallucination started. One of the guards fired wildly at nothing, eyes wide with terror. Another dropped his weapon and clutched his skull, shrieking. Shapes twisted in the darkness, shadows moving where none should be. Gork staggered, gripping the wall. Vent control, who accessed vent controls. The laughter that answered him was soft, too soft, and it came from behind him. He spun around, raising his weapon, but there was nothing there. A whisper brushed past his ear. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." Gorg's own scream joined the others. On the upper decks, Overlord Varric stood before the command console, his claws digging into the metal as he watched the chaos unfold through the ship's surveillance feeds. "Report," he growled. One of his officers stammered, barely holding his composure. "The human, he's overriding our security systems. Internal comms are jammed. Doors are locking and unlocking at random. He's turning the ship against us." Varric's tail lashed in agitation. "A single human cannot do this. He has helped." "Maybe," the officer admitted, voice shaking. "But it doesn't matter. He's winning." The monitors flickered. One by one, the security feeds cut out, plunging the control room into darkness. Then, a voice slithered through the speakers. Slavers died screaming. The bridge crew shuddered. Even Varric felt something cold settle in his gut. He turned sharply to his enforcers. "Find him. Kill him. Now." But it was already too late. The human had been studying them since the moment he woke up. He knew their patterns, their weaknesses, the way their ship breathed. He knew that fear was a weapon sharper than any blade, and he wielded it mercilessly. In the lower decks, guards fired into empty hallways, their nerves shattered. Doors hissed open without warning, revealing corpses that hadn't been their seconds before. Some of the slavers turned on each other, seeing threats in every shadow. And amidst the carnage, Reaper moved unseen. The prisoners had rallied behind him, not because he had asked them to, but because they had seen something in him that they hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. He had given them weapons, a purpose. But most of all, he had given them a chance. He pressed a stolen comm unit to his lips. All free prisoners converge on the armory. Tyrax, the small, wiry alien who had once called him insane, responded immediately. "It's secured. We're ready." Reaper's lips curled into a smirk. "Good. Now let's take the rest of the ship." The next phase of the plan unfolded with brutal efficiency. The prisoners stormed the key control hubs, overwhelming what little resistance remained. The slavers had always believed themselves untouchable. That arrogance was their downfall. By the time Reaper reached the main reactor chamber, the battle was already decided. The ship was his. But there was still one last loose end. Varric stood on the command deck, his last remaining guards forming a desperate barricade around him. The doors to the bridge had been sealed, but they all knew it wouldn't last. Then the lights cut out. The emergency backup flickered, bathing the room in eerie red. A thud, a gurgled scream. One by one, the guards fell. Varric turned, heart pounding, his claws wrapped around his weapon, though his hands were slick with sweat. A figure stepped through the smoke. No hesitation, no fear, just death. Varric fired. The plasma bolt tore through the air, straight through where the human had been a fraction of a second before. Then pain exploded across his wrist. His weapon clattered to the floor, his fingers severed. Reaper loomed over him, his knife dripping. Varric gasped, clutching his mangled hand. "Wait! You don't have to." Reaper silenced him with a brutal strike to the throat. Varric choked, his vision dimming, his strength fading. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the human's cold, expressionless eyes. The battle was over. The Reaper had come. The bridge was silent except for the low hum of the ship systems and the ragged breathing of the last surviving slavers. The bodies of their comrades lay sprawled across the floor, weapons still clutched in lifeless hands. Blood, both alien and human, painted the walls in violent streaks. The air reeked of ozone from burned circuits and the metallic tang of death. Reaper stood in the center, motionless, his blade dripping onto the grated floor. His gray eyes swept across the survivors, analyzing, deciding. The slavers cowered before him, stripped of their arrogance, their cruelty replaced by a primal, quivering fear. They had ruled the ship with brutality, convinced of their own invincibility. Now they knelt, powerless, waiting for judgment. One of them, a trembling officer with scales dulled by stress, swallowed hard and raised shaking hands. "Please," he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We surrender." Reaper's expression didn't change. He reached down, picking up a discarded plasma rifle, examining it with disinterest. The slaver flinched at the motion, expecting execution. Instead, Reaper tossed the rifle aside with a clatter. "Surrender?" His voice was calm, almost amused. "Funny, I don't recall that being an option for your prisoners." The officer's throat bobbed as he struggled to find words. We were just following orders." Reaper crouched, leveling his gaze with the broken creature. "So were the ones who died screaming in your pens." He let the words sink in before standing. "You chose this. Every one of you." A murmur of despair rippled through the remaining slavers. They had seen what he was capable of. They knew there would be no mercy. Reaper turned away from them, pressing a bloodied hand to the command console. The ship's systems flickered, responding to his touch. The slavers may have built this vessel, but it was his now. A crackling voice came through the ship-wide comms. "Reaper," Tyrak said, his voice carrying both exhaustion and awe. "We've secured the cargo bay. The prisoners," he hesitated. "The freed crew is awaiting your command." Reaper exhaled slowly. "Prepare the escape pods." A stunned silence followed. Then, "You're letting them go." Reaper's eyes flickered toward the slavers. "They're going to run," he said flatly. "They're going to tell others what happened here. And every slaver in the galaxy will know that the hunted are no longer prey." The officer on the floor gaped. You're letting us live." Reaper turned his back to them. "I don't need to kill you." His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. "Because you'll never sleep again without seeing my face." The slavers shuddered. Some wept. Others simply sat in stunned silence. Reaper activated the controls. The ship's automated systems took over, guiding the remaining slavers toward the escape bay. The doors hissed open, beckoning them toward exile. One by one, they stumbled forward, desperate to escape the nightmare that had claimed their ship. None of them dared look back. As the last of them vanished, Reaper turned to the remaining prisoners, his people now. Some were warriors, battle-hardened and ready. Others were frail, barely able to stand, their bodies bearing the scars of captivity. Reaper took them all in. "We're not slaves anymore," he said, his voice steady. "We're not victims." He looked at the ship around them, the vast metal beast that had once been their prison. "This ship belongs to us now." A murmur of agreement, a spark of something dangerous igniting in their eyes. "Hope!" Reaper flexed his fingers, feeling the weight of his name settle over him. He had been captured. He had been caged. But now he was free, and the galaxy would never forget what happened here. The void stretched endless beyond the ship's reinforced windows, a vast sea of stars indifferent to the carnage that had unfolded within its steel belly. The slavers' escape pods had already vanished into the black, spiraling toward some distant corner of the galaxy where they would cower in the shadows, whispering the name of the nightmare that had undone them. Reaper stood on the bridge, hands braced against the cold metal console, his reflection staring back at him in the dark glass. The ship hummed beneath his fingertips, alive in a way it had never been before. It was no longer a vessel of suffering, no longer a cage. It was his now, theirs. Behind him, the freed prisoners gathered in tense silence. They had fought, bled, and survived, but survival was not victory. Not yet. Tyrak stepped forward, his small frame stiff with hesitation. "What now?" Reaper exhaled slowly. The question was a simple one, but the weight it carried was immense. What now? They had torn their chains free, but the galaxy did not welcome the broken. He turned to face them. Some bore the hardened stares of warriors who had long since abandoned the notion of peace. Others trembled, still unsteady in their newfound freedom. "We decide," Reaper said at last, his voice even unwavering. "We decide what we become." A murmur rippled through the group. Some cast uneasy glances toward the controls, toward the vastness beyond the ship's hull. A heavy-set alien with deep scars lining his arms crossed them over his chest. "And what do you say we become?" His voice carried the edge of a challenge, but not defiance. Reaper met his gaze without hesitation. "Something the slavers fear." The words landed like a thunderclap. Tyrax inhaled sharply, but he didn't argue. None of them did. The silence stretched until another voice, softer, uncertain, cut through it. "But we're not soldiers. Some of us, we just want to go home." Reaper inclined his head. "Then you will." He glanced at the console, fingers dancing over the controls. The ship responded, its systems flickering as it awaited his command. "We'll set course for neutral space. Those who wish to leave can. No one is a prisoner here." A beat passed. Some exhaled in quiet relief. Others stood taller, determination setting into their bones. The scarred alien nodded. "And the rest of us?" Reaper looked over them, seeing not broken captives, but something new, something forged in fire and sharpened in suffering. "You stay," he said simply. "You fight." A slow grin spread across Tyrax's face. "You mean to hunt them, don't you?" Reaper's lips barely twitched, but the ghost of a smile was there. "I mean to remind them that they are prey." The ship vibrated beneath them as the engines roared to life, as if it, too, had been waiting for the moment of decision. Reaper turned back toward the window, watching as the stars stretched before them. The hunted had become the hunters, and the galaxy would never be the same.